This video is my personal reflection on the BBC News article, "Israel Rejects Trump's 15-Point Plan for Gaza," Netanyahu says, by John Donnison and George Wright, published on August 9, 2026. The article reports that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected the proposed plan and said Israel would not withdraw its forces until Hamas was genuinely disarmed. The article also reports that Trump's Board of Peace had announced an agreement for the complete disarmament of Hamas and other armed groups in Gaza. Hamas, however, stated that surrendering its heavy weapons was conditional on Israel first ending military operations and withdrawing its forces. Hamas nevertheless said that it remained committed to implementing the agreement. And this is where my personal reflection begins. In my opinion, the contradiction is difficult to ignore. Hamas speaks about disarmament, but attaches conditions that would first require Israel to surrender much of the military leverage that could actually compel disarmament. To put it in an old expression, and I emphasize that this is my personal opinion, beggars cannot be choosers. A defeated military organization normally does not dictate the conditions under which it will someday consider giving up the weapons that allowed it to start the war in the first place. And there is another part of this conflict that I believe deserves much more attention. Again, this is my interpretation, not a statement made in the BBC article. I believe Hamas's remaining bargaining power rests substantially on the lives and suffering of Palestinian civilians. Hamas cannot defeat Israel conventionally. It cannot reverse the military balance. But civilian suffering creates enormous international pressure on Israel to stop fighting before Hamas has actually been disarmed. That creates a terrible paradox. The greater the humanitarian suffering inside Gaza, the greater the political pressure on Israel to stop military operations. And if that pressure results in Israeli withdrawal while Hamas remains armed, then civilian suffering has effectively produced strategic value for Hamas. I find that profoundly disturbing. It means that the civilians whom political leaders around the world understandably want to protect may simultaneously become the strongest source of pressure preserving the armed organization that governs among them. History gives us uncomfortable parallels. Before October 7, 2023, Israel and Hamas were not engaged in the kind of full-scale war that followed the attack. Whatever one calls the arrangements that existed before October 7th, they plainly did not prevent Hamas from launching the attack that transformed the conflict. Europe also learned the danger of believing that agreements alone can extinguish military ambition. In 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich with an agreement intended to preserve peace. Less than a year later, Europe was at war. Imagine a different Second World War. Suppose the Allied powers had reached Germany and then stopped because continued fighting was producing unacceptable civilian suffering. Imagine telling Hitler, "We will withdraw. We will stop bombing. You may keep your remaining army. You may retain your weapons. And sometime later, when conditions are acceptable to you, we will discuss disarmament." Would that have ended the war? Or would it simply have given Nazi Germany time to rebuild? The same thought experiment can be applied to Imperial Japan. Imagine that after years of brutal war, the United States stopped military pressure without requiring Japan's effective surrender and disarmament. No more bombing. No invasion threat. No destruction of military capability. Simply a pause, followed by negotiations while Japan retained the ability to resume war. Would historians today call that peace? Or unfinished war? We can go much further back. Imagine the Greeks surrounding Troy and then deciding that civilian suffering required them to sail home while Troy remained fortified and its army intact. Imagine Titus withdrawing from Jerusalem because the siege had become too destructive, while leaving the military confrontation unresolved. Imagine the Ottoman forces approaching Constantinople in 1453 and then withdrawing indefinitely for humanitarian reasons, while leaving the strategic struggle exactly where it stood. These events are obviously different from Gaza. I am not claiming that Hamas is Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, Troy, Jerusalem, or Constantinople. Historical analogies are not equations, but they illuminate the same ancient question. When does mercy end a war, and when does mercy merely postpone it? Humanitarian considerations matter enormously. Civilian life matters enormously. But protecting civilians today cannot mean creating the conditions for another war tomorrow. That is why the question of disarmament is so important. The BBC article reports that Israel's position is essentially no withdrawal until genuine disarmament. Hamas's position makes handing over heavy weapons conditional upon Israeli withdrawal and an end to military operations. Those positions are not merely technical disagreements. They represent two completely different ideas about how this war ends. One approach says, remove the military threat, then withdraw. The other effectively asks Israel to withdraw, stop applying military pressure, and trust that disarmament will follow. After October 7th, asking Israelis to place their security primarily in another promise is asking them to forget the very event that began this war. My conclusion is therefore simple. A ceasefire can stop shooting. A document can promise peace. Diplomats can announce agreements. But none of those things necessarily ends a war. A war truly ends when the parties no longer possess either the ability or the intention to restart it. And if an armed organization retains its weapons, retains its military structure, and retains the capacity to wage another war, then the world should at least ask whether it is negotiating peace, or merely negotiating the length of the intermission before the next war. Weapons do not create wars by themselves, but wars rarely end while those who began them still possess both the means and the will to begin another.